Hey there, I am Barb Higgins, and this is 1,000 Tiny Steps. In this podcast, I share my stories of love, loss, triumph, and tragedy as I continue to retrace my steps and ponder what led to the death of my daughter Molly. By doing so, I hope to not only help myself, but to bring purpose and possibility to those who listen. If you are ready to laugh, cry, shake your head in disbelief, then tie, buckle, lace up, or slip on your shoes and join me as we begin our 1,000 Tiny Steps.
Hey everybody, Barb Higgins here, welcoming you to episode 174 of 1,000 Tiny Steps. So first of all, Happy New Year. I'm sitting in my yellow office recording on Black Friday, but it is New Year's Eve and I am in Bali doing who knows what. Listen to my socials, or if you've been following my trip, then you know what I'm doing. So New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve for me evokes two things that are relevant to my little fun episode that I'm doing right now on lies and myth information and truth manipulation. So New Year's Eve is in America a major reason to go out and get shit-faced. And that's what a lot of young people do. It may be a bit different now, but I know that, as a Gen Xer in college in the 80s, that's what we did. We went out and partied on New Year's Eve. And many of my New Year's Eves are fuzzy at best in terms of my memory. And others are fine. I've had many sober New Year's Eves. In my older age, I go to sleep at 10 o'clock. I watch a rerun of the ball dropping. So oftentimes I would find out about what happened by asking somebody. One of my problems as a drinker, a consumer of alcohol, is that I would often forget. I was a blackout drinker. And it was very unpredictable. I didn't have to drink 50 beers to black out. Sometimes I could drink, so let me use a more realistic number. Sometimes I could drink 5 beers and just be chasing the buzz, be fine, or not feel shit-faced. And other times I could drink 3 beers and be under the table and wake up in the morning and not know what had happened and how I'd gotten where I'd gotten. I have several interesting stories of waking up far away from where I last remembered being and being a bit horrified by the fact that I had no recollection of how I'd gotten where I was. I would say what happened, and I would listen to people's stories about what happened. And I would ultimately believe what they told me because I had no basis of reality to not believe what they told me. What I have learned in my life as a person who has spent a lot of time in the news, I live a very public life. I am very open about the details of my life. So it's not surprising that I had had a lot of lies and exaggeration and misinterpretations of the truth told about me. And it's frustrating when these mistruths are printed in a newspaper or testified in a school board meeting or something. It's frustrating to listen to people lie about you or watch them lie about you or read about the lies they've said about you and not have people truly believe you. I'm the kind of person, have I lied in my life? Of course I have. Have I twisted the truth? We've all twisted the truth. Have I framed a story in a certain way to make sure it got the reaction I wanted? Yes, all of us have. You can't live life and not do this because so much of life is a dance of communication. So I have some examples from my own life. I was coaching in Bow and I got my tattoo and I sent a picture of it to a bunch of students, parents actually, and the athletic director. So it clearly wasn't anything weird because I sent it to several people and I did that on purpose. One of the people I sent it to decided it offended her and scared her. And she went to the administration and said that she was afraid of me and all of this. So Bo handled it terribly. They removed me from coaching for sending a picture of a tattoo. That's it. The same picture I sent to the AD that put me on suspension. So this triggered an anonymous letter from somebody that was full of horrifying things that absolutely were not true. Peppered in there were variations of things that were true, but painted in a completely different and inaccurate way. So it was clearly someone that knew me that wrote this. I have no idea who it was, but the Concord Monitor took it, that's a newspaper, and wrote about it as if it were true. The Bow School District, Mike Desilets, and the principal at the time, whose name escapes me, and the athletic director, Dean Cascadden, great educators here, just took the letter as more important than the truth, and that what might happen to me in my mental health and the mental health of 30 girls on the cross-country team that knew all that was going on was crap. So it was a disastrous mess. It was such a classic example of, let's take a story, let's manipulate the story, let's throw in some facts, but twist them a bit to paint a narrative, then throw a bunch of lies in so that we can get the result that we want. Whoever did it got the result because I was not asked to return to coach at Bow. So yeah, that was sort of an interesting thing. So why the big long segue? Well, because we as consumers of information are often very, very willing to believe what we see. So one of my most eye-opening experiences was watching the movie Pocahontas years ago, a Disney animated movie. Gracie and Molly loved all the princess movies. I had done some researching, just general American history, and knew by the time Pocahontas came out that nothing about the white settlers and the Native Americans all living harmoniously forever and always was true. There was always some measure of control, one side to the other. You look at the United States of America, in under 300 years, we totally decimated the people that already lived here, put them in little reservations, and it's the US Constitution written by white guys coast to coast. Not necessarily a bad thing, but we can't paint a narrative that's too easily disproven. So I wondered, how could Pocahontas be a princess like she was a little girl who was kidnapped and, forced into a role that she didn't choose for her life? And that isn't the story that was told at all. They basically took all of the events that happened in 1600s, Virginia, wherever it takes place, and twisted it around. They made Pocahontas a young woman. They had Pocahontas voluntarily join John Smith and the white settlers to work with them and live their lives. And they had Pocahontas marry John Smith. Pocahontas was 12, taken against her will. It wasn't until 9 years later, seven years later, that she married another guy named John, John Rolfe, I think, who was not John Smith. If you asked her, which how do you do that? Was her childhood happy? She has two very different aspects of her childhood. Before she was taken, abducted by the white folks, and after. So I don't care for Pocahontas. And that isn't a movie or a theme that gets a whole lot of attention at Disney World, as far as I can tell. Pocahontas isn't a regular princess that visits and has, that is out there a lot. It's heart-wrenching because we took an actual person and made her life into something stereotypical and covered over and sugared up and made okay. And it wasn't okay. Talk about re-victimizing someone whose life was really based on initial victimization. So that got me to thinking and coming up with episode ideas. What can I talk about? Where are their lies? Where is their myth information? Where is their miscommunication? And I thought, oh my gosh, movies that are based on real life. So I'm going to start with movies that are based on actual people. When I was in college, I think it was the 88 Olympics, perhaps, maybe the 84 Olympics, Lake Placid Olympics. There was a really good figure skater named Nancy Kerrigan and another really good figure skater named Tonya Harding. And Tonya Harding was the hardcore South Boston girl, right? Like she had a very, very rough life and struggled and financial struggles, and her making the Olympic team and becoming a national figure skating champion was amazing. Nancy Kerrigan was, wealthy Boston suburb, all the best in all of this. So there was animosity, well, a lot of painted animosity from Tonya Harding to Nancy Kerrigan. So Nancy Kerrigan was attacked, hit in the leg with a metal pipe, and had a knee injury that potentially could have kept her out of the Olympics. It was all over the news. And Tonya Harding, of course, wanted to make sure, pled innocent. No, I knew nothing about it, but it was Tonya Harding's boyfriend and someone else that attacked Nancy Kerrigan. So that part of the story is true. People that knew Tonya Harding attacked Nancy Kerrigan, hoping to keep her out of the Olympics so Tonya Harding could win. Now, of course, you get speculation. Let's paint a picture that Tonya Harding orchestrated this herself, that she was in charge. Let's get her kicked out of skating. It was all of this chaos swirling around and around. So in the middle of this, the Olympics are coming. So you can't keep someone out of the Olympics or trying out for the Olympics until you have an official, legal, binding thing going on. So off they go to the Olympics. Tonya Harding had a terrible time. Her shoelace broke. She was a mess. Nancy Kerrigan did not win. So several years later, a movie comes out called I, Tonya. I, Tonya. So I saw the movie, and quite honestly, I thought the movie was based on actual truth. I thought the movie was an actual recounting, an accurate recounting of her childhood and all of this. So basically, it took the story of a skater from poverty and lack of education and a tough mother, making it big. They took that, but they made the characters themselves almost caricatures. As I look back on it now, it reminds me of the movie Pharma, Big Pharma, with Matt Broderick about Purdue Pharmaceutical. That movie is like an exaggeration. Everything is exaggerated. So is it historically accurate? Maybe. But the characters and the scenery is embellished to paint a picture. So when I was looking up I, Tonya for this podcast episode, it's called a mockumentary. I never knew that. I'm an educated person. I watch the news. Because I've been lied about and made fun of for things that aren't true, and people look at me and assume things about me, I'm sensitive to this stuff. And I just thought all of those things were true. I remember thinking, boy, Tonya Harding's mother was awful. Well, maybe Tonya Harding's mother was awful sometimes, but the woman in the movie was terrifyingly awful. Was that true? Did Tonya did her mother not let her go to the bathroom so she peed herself on the ice in front of everybody? Did that really happen? Or was that something that was put in there to prove a point? So if it were a fictional story and you were creating a narrative and creating the script from nothing and making it up, you can have your characters be however you want them to be. That's the license of writing fiction. My friend Virginia that wrote Motherland, she prefers fiction because she has creative license and control over the characters and what they say. She doesn't have to moderate her writing to match fact. So I, Tonya was a mockumentary. A lot of what was in that movie is not based on fact at all. It's based on exaggerating a stereotype to make a point. Was it a good movie? That the acting was incredible. I mean, Margot Robbie played Tonya Harding. So the actors and the actresses' performances were stunning. They were really, really well done. Allison Janney played Tonya Harding's mother. Allison Janney is a hilarious mother in this TV show Mom. She was a serious actress in the TV show The West Wing. She was an unbelievable performer representing a really abusive mother. She was believable. I was amazed by it. But that isn't really what Tonya Harding's mother was like. But I realize now that what I saw and took to be true was a mockumentary, a huge exaggeration of reality. A Beautiful Mind is about a mathematician who has schizophrenia. The word schizophrenia is like tummy ache. A tummy ache could be period cramps, a tummy ache could be indigestion, a tummy ache could be food poisoning, a tummy ache could be the stomach flu. Schizophrenia has a lot of different ways it manifests itself, one of which is auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, perverse thinking, like exaggerated thinking. And in the movie A Beautiful Mind, the character was inaccurately portrayed. The lead character a lot of the movie plot was around hallucinations that the lead character had. He did not suffer from visual hallucinations. So all of that aspect of the movie is inaccurate. If you're creating a movie based on an actual person and you're sort of telling their story, you need to keep it accurate. If they wanted to write a movie based upon the mathematician's life, then you change all the names, you change the whole entire story. They left out a divorce. They left out some abuse and neglect and mistreatment of his wife. They left out a lot of factual information that was important to the actual story to paint a picture of this mathematician in the movie in a much more positive way. When you have a movie about somebody with a mental illness, I can see that you don't want to discredit or insult schizophrenics, and we love to umbrella things. So if this schizophrenic in this movie acted this way, then that's what all schizophrenics are like. I mean, that's not true at all. Another movie that comes to mind is Erin Brockovich. So Erin Brockovich is a movie about a woman named Erin Brockovich. And she is, again, a single mother struggling to raise her family, working really hard, gets in a car accident, tries to get insurance coverage, a settlement in the accident, and starts to work at this law firm. So the movie portrays her as, always wearing a push-up bra. She's portrayed by Julia Roberts, always big cleavage, always boobs showing, and really relying on that. And you think of Erin Brockovich as somebody that, pushes her boobs up out of her shirt to get what she wants. And that isn't really how she was. When the movie was over and Erin Brockovich, the actual Erin Brockovich, was interviewed, she said that the factual stuff around the PG&E lawsuit was accurate, but that she was misrepresented on several occasions. One of them was her relationship with Masri. She had a different lawyer at first. When she went into the law firm to work, they ended up working on that. There were a couple of characters that she connected with that were inaccurately portrayed. In the movie, they come across as really good people. And in real life, they were not good people at all, and tried to sue the movie to get money. There was a scene where Erin Brockovich's character really tries to use her sexiness to make somebody uncomfortable enough that she could get some documents and photocopy them at a city office that the person wasn't supposed to let her do it. She was offended by that. She said, that's not at all what I did. You do come away with an image of Erin Brockovich and her relationships and her children, how she is, as not somebody you'd really want to hang around with. Yes, her work was phenomenal, and that comes through in the movie, but her personality and her character came across a bit trashy, and that was hard on the actual Erin Brockovich. It's reassuring to know that the legal pieces are accurate. Okay, another one, Newsies. So this is a musical, Newsies. Molly and Gracie had a couple of dances from songs from this movie. When I used to babysit Katie when she was little, Kenny's daughter, Newsies is one of her favorite movies. We watched it all the time. So the basic story takes place around the great newspaper strike in the early 1900s in New York City that then became nationwide. But it's told through the perspective of the little boys that deliver the newspapers. So you have this whole storyline about the older boy that's in charge of a group and all the conflict between them and deciding to support the strike or not support the strike and all these like heroic and amazing things that these little boys did. And that isn't what happened at all. None of those characters actually existed. They took a very sort of significant but mundane news story and wrote a bunch of songs about it. You can't write songs about boring adults, so the songs are about kids. The kids are performing the songs. You created a musical out of a news story. Hamilton kind of does the same thing, creates a musical out of, a historical fact. The Book of Mormon comes to mind. I haven't seen any of these plays and I'm not familiar with them, so I didn't include them here, but always the basic storyline might be intact because it's a good story, but all the details, which is what catches your eye, which is what stays in your memory, are often totally not true at all. A more historical one is Amadeus. This is a movie that came out in the late 80s about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a major famous composer, my favorite composer. And in the movie, he's painted as a whack job, this crazy man that runs around and sleeps with a lot of women and gets drunk, which may or may not have been true, but he's portrayed in the movie as almost a clown, like a giggly clown. And I know my father, my biological father, he introduced me to Mozart and we saw that movie together and he hated it. He was disgusted by it. He thought that it painted Mozart out inaccurately. Now, do we really know what Mozart was like? No. But if he were a boring character, it doesn't make for an interesting movie. The movie also created division between Mozart and another composer named Antonio Salieri. And Salieri narrates the movie, and the opening scene is him like in a nursing home talking to somebody. He's trying to come to terms with the end of his life, right? And he wants to talk to a minister and confess a crime. The alleged crime is that he poisoned Mozart, and that's why Mozart died. And so Salieri's playing, here I wrote this, here I wrote this. And then he plays dun, 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 dun. And the priest or the minister that's talking to him continues it, dun, 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 dun. And Salieri character says, yeah, I didn't write that one. That's Mozart. And so begins the movie of Salieri's intense jealousy of Mozart. There may have been intense jealousy, but the Salieri murdering Mozart is like an urban legend. But they made a whole movie about it. So the average person who's like, oh, I think I'll go to the movies and learn about Mozart would assume that all of this was true, that this whole story, because the entire premise of the movie is based on Salieri potentially killing Mozart. And it goes back and forth. You'll see the old Salieri with the minister in the nursing home, and then it goes back into when Mozart was still alive and young. Mozart died in his early 30s, or maybe he was 30. That was one that offended me. I loved the movie. I've actually watched it several times. It's a movie that I would watch again because it's really well done. Sort of like Erin Brockovich, you watch it over and over and over. And every time I watch it, I feel differently about what I'm seeing. But it took a basic premise and embellished it completely and made a movie about it. Now, Mozart's not around to defend himself or to change the facts, so we don't really know. But as I talk about these movies, what blows me away is the fact that there are probably hundreds of thousands of people who think what they're watching is factual. Oh, it's a documentary. It's based on real life. Okay, a movie based on real life and real events isn't a documentary. So a great example of that is Sully. There was a pilot whose last name was Sullivan, who was the pilot of the plane that landed in the Hudson River. And this was like captured live. A lot of people filmed it. So you saw it. You could hear Sully on the radio to the airport saying, we're going to land in the Hudson. And then you've got news coverage showing somebody's, iPhone camera filming it. So basically they take off from a New York airport, birds go in the engines, the engines stall, there's no engine. The plane now has no engine. So a plane, if you keep the plane level, it will continue to fly, but it loses altitude slowly. So the pilot now has to decide, where am I going to crash land this thing? Can I get to an airport? He couldn't turn around without engines because that would topple the balance. There was not much he could do. All he could do was look around what was in front of him and figure out where could he land. And he realized that if he slowed down, he calculated it, and he landed in the Hudson. Nobody died. He didn't crash into a bridge. The plane didn't flip over. Nobody died. The plane floated long enough to get people onto the wings, into lifeboats. And of course, people on either side of the river jumped into action and got out there and rescued people. So nobody died. Did they stand on a plane that was slowly sinking in the Hudson River? Yes, they did. The whole premise of the movie, and again, I ended up thinking this was true. Like, how could they do that to him? The whole premise of the movie was the FAA and all that in the government wanting to fire him, find him negligent in the choice to land in the river. and that he could have made it to Teterboro, another airport, or back to LaGuardia, which of course he couldn't. And so you go through all of these simulators and all the different things that pilots do to train. And the basic ending of the combination of the movie is, yeah, in a simulator, you get to, how many times did the pilot try it in the simulator before he went to Teterboro? 17 times. When Sully's character basically says, I had 30 seconds. Like, you're comparing two things. So did the movie send a good message on how unfair it would be to treat somebody like that? Yes. But Sully wasn't treated like that. He was never not a hero. Yes, the crash was investigated. Yes, the plane was investigated. But he was never accused of fabricating what happened or making a negligent choice at all. So that's another example. P.T. Barnum, The Greatest Showman. My good friend Deb saw this movie, and there are two daughters in it that reminded her of Gracie and Molly, and it's based on the life of P.T. Barnum. So it sets up his childhood in being poor, and he falls in love with this woman who he ends up marrying and having children with, who is rich. And you have all of the antagonistic behavior between her family and him. And he goes off, and they get married and everything. He goes off and he founds the P.T. Barnum and the circus. And it takes place in a building, it's not outside. And you see all, the bearded lady and all of the bizarre people, the conjoined twins, the Siamese twins, they called them back then. But you fall in love with P.T. Barnum because you see him using his struggles in this noble way to create entertainment that's affordable, that everybody can come to. And the music is fantastic, and the actors and actresses are all really pretty, and the lighting is phenomenal. So you leave there thinking, wow, that P.T. Barnum, what a great guy. And really, P.T. Barnum was kind of a douche. He exploited people. There's a famous story of this elderly woman, an elderly Black woman, that he would pawn off as like a slave to a famous politician, George Washington, I actually think. And that she's like 120 years old, and people would come and look at her. And she was unhealthy and sick. And then she died, and he wanted to make money by letting people watch her autopsy. I mean, that's gruesome. But when you think of the people that were there, a bearded woman. So you have a woman with a beard, and you pay money to go look at her. So you sit there and get looked at all day. You're like a sideshow freak. Awful, awful. And he based a lot of his circus acts on these very things. The world's tallest man, the world's smallest man, like anyone with physical deformities, were often showcased at his shows. He was horribly cruel to animals. The animal cruelty is unbelievably well documented. You don't see animals in circuses anymore. When you go to a circus, I saw a Facebook post just recently, and we went to the circus, no animals anymore. So it's all people doing the performing. I find that interesting. We don't use people that can't make their own decisions. No informed consent for a bear to be in a bear show, right? They don't do that in the circus anymore. But that movie, yes, you saw his weaknesses and his flaws when he gets caught kissing another woman, when he gets obsessed with making someone famous and he leaves his family. And, yes, you see all the poor choices, but you come away from the movie really thankful that he invented the circus. Okay, so I loved going to the circus as a kid. That was a huge piece of my generation. There were circuses by the time, so my mother's generation was much more the P.T. Barnum and Bailey circus generation, the baby boomer generation. Gen X, which is sort of what I'm at the beginning of, we were getting into amusement parks now and movies and other ways of entertainment. Circuses weren't like the be all and the end all like they were when my mother was growing up. But this movie definitely wanted to paint a positive picture of the circus, and it does. It does. Remember the Titans. Remember the Titans is a story about racial integration between Blacks and whites in the late 60s and 70s. When I was in 5th grade, desegregation became a thing in Boston, and it was forced busing. So they wanted all the neighborhood schools in every neighborhood to be integrated. So not only wealthy people were in Brookline, and not only poor people were in Dorchester, and not only white people were in Newton, and not only Black people were in Roxbury. So you had all this forced busing, which of course didn't work. So they ultimately, from the forced busing, they created programs. And I remember being in college and David calling them the Metco kids. And the Metco kids were inner city children that applied for and got accepted to go to high school in wealthy suburbs. So Newton North had a Metco program. In Concord, we had ABC, A Better Chance. And it was a program that brought inner city youth from Columbus, Ohio to Concord, New Hampshire, so they could go to school at Concord High School. So the only people of color when I was in high school were the ABC kids. And they all lived together in this big house downtown on Thompson Street. I remember it positively, and I'm still friendly with a lot of the people that were quote unquote ABC kids. Actually, just the other day, this woman named Yvette, I've talked about her many times on this podcast. She ran cross country with me, and she was an ABC kid, and she raised her family here. She still lives in Concord and loves living here. Remember the Titans took a football rivalry, a school with a football team, and painted a picture that it was the only school that was integrated. And the integration was forced, and all the black kids came to the school, and the new football coach was black, and they were all hated, and there was all this fighting and strife. Well, I'm quite sure that was true, but it was systemic. It was district-wide and citywide and statewide. It wasn't just this one high school. So in the movie, you see this one team and their transformation and learning how to get along as an example for all the other high schools, and that because of them, all the other high schools followed. Well, when the events of the movie took place, integration was like 5 or 6 years old. It was already starting. It wasn't this one season, everything is fine now. The characters were real, but again, the stories of their lives were a bit manipulated to make them more believable. And then actual events were changed. For example, there's a player who gets in a car accident in the middle of the season in the movie, and he's paralyzed. He can no longer play on the team. In real life, his injury happened when the season was over. He was in the state title game. The state title game was not a nail biter. In the movie, it's this nail biter, back and forth, and they don't win until the very end. And you see the injured player in the hospital bed cheering, as his team wins. Yes, that's a much more Hollywood scene, but it's not accurate. So somebody that doesn't really know the history of that team and those coaches and those athletes would take those things as true. At the end of Remember the Titans, they went through each character to say what they ended up doing with their lives and all of this. So again, when you have that factual relevance, I thought that the storyline was all accurate, and it wasn't. Things got moved around a lot. Sort of like in The Sound of Music, where they changed the ages of the kids and they manipulated when things happened and where. Maybe it's to create a linear story for a movie, but these are people. When it's a movie about somebody that's still around, like P.T. Barnum isn't still around, Amadeus isn't still around. The children that were the Newsies aren't still around. So Pocahontas, died 200 years ago. So is it fair that these stories are fabricated? No. But you're not hurting an actual person that's still alive. You are hurting the legacy of that person or what people believe about that person. Another movie that was actually about a person was a movie called Rudy. Now, Rudy is a real person. He has some developmental delays. He went to Notre Dame and was very involved in football. He loved football. It was his game. And so he's actually a public speaker and goes around and speaks at schools. And years ago, he came to Concord. And he was a motivational speaker about not letting your disability stand in your way. So the movie paints this whole storyline when he's in college of the team wanting him to be allowed to play and the coach saying no and all this strife and making sure he got, it wasn't that way at all. But Montana, who was a really good football player, was on the football team and involved in it. So he remembers it. And when the movie came out, he was disgusted. He felt like it took an entire experience of his life and made up a story about it. And now everyone that sees the movie thinks that the story is the truth. I'd have to rewatch the movie and read up on it. But when I watched it, I took it as true. They're all cheering, Rudy, Rudy. And in the movie, you feel that they're supporting him, that this is a great thing. And actually, in real life, the cheering of Rudy was in a completely different scenario. And it was more, not a joke, like a mean joke, but it was more like making a point. Like, yeah, well, let's cheer for Rudy, because the team's not going to win or something like that. So they're cheering for Rudy, but not because he's playing football, for a completely different reason. To me, not only are you hurting an actual person that's alive by misrepresenting them, but this is a person who perhaps can articulate accurately and clearly, because of the developmental delays, how they feel about that. Was there informed consent by Rudy to change the story that way, to change the narrative, to rework it? Most of the people involved in what actually happened did not like that movie. So I find that to be interesting. The Blind Side. So this movie always puts a knot in my stomach because it came out and was popular right around the time I lost my job in the school district. And I watched it on New Year's Eve. Here's a little connection. I had drinks and I was downstairs, and I remember Kenny came down because I hadn't come up to bed, and I just was sobbing and sobbing. Like, I'm a good person. Why am I losing my job? I was a mess. And I'd watched the movie The Blind Side. If I'm having a hard day, I can't watch that movie. But it's about Michael Orr, who was an NFL football player who played for Baltimore before they were the Colts, before they were the Ravens. They were the Baltimore Colts. It took place in Tennessee, and he was a child that was in the foster system, ended up at a private school, and living with a family called the Tuohys. So those basic facts are accurate. But I remember when the movie came out, Michael Orr himself was angry because he felt that he was misrepresented. He was portrayed as somebody that was sort of this this big sort of dopey, overweight kid that wasn't super athletic, got convinced to play football and didn't understand the game. And they had to use all these family references and survival techniques to get him to understand football. It painted a beautiful picture of a learning disabled, out of shape child who was huge, becoming this amazing football player. Bottom line was, Michael Orr had been a really good athlete his entire life. Even when he was in and out of foster care, he understood football and was a good football player. The other piece is it painted a picture of the Tui family as they swooped in and saved him. And the reality is the Tui family did do amazing things for him, gave him a life that he would never have had. But he lived in a lot of other homes and bounced around quite a bit before they finally agreed to take him in. Now, who knows all of the reasons for that reality, but the movie painted it out as a very, very simple story with the boy wandering around and homeless and sleeping outside and not athletic and having nothing, to this family coming in and doing all of these things, created amazing relationships between Michael Orr's character and the siblings, the Tui kids. So when you read critique about it, for the most part, the Tui family feels okay about the movie. Michael feels okay about most of the movie. It gave great attention to him and his career, and it gave great attention to the plight of children in foster care, how children that grow up in the projects oftentimes live there for generations and generations because they can't get out, drug and gun violence. It opened a lot of people's eyes to those realities. But in terms of the actual people involved, these are high profile people, and Hollywood took a lot of liberties with the story that common sense would say don't make sense. It's not like, remember the Titans, those football players, were playing 40, 50, 60 years ago. Now, Michael Orr, when the movie came out, he was still a professional football player. Recently, Michael Orr actually filed a lawsuit against the Tui family for money he says they owe him. So I'm not sure the details of all of that. My initial thoughts were, how ungrateful could he be? But when I read all of the historical inaccuracies and the details that weren't actually true about him, I felt terrible, like I was quick to judge. Again, as someone like me who always wants to make sure I know the actual story before I make a judgment, or it's not my job to judge, period. But I was quick to believe what the movie told me because it felt good, right? It was a feel-good story. The movie that I'll wrap up with is a movie called Homeless to Harvard. So Liz Murray was a girl, and the movie is based on it, who grew up in an incredibly dysfunctional family in New York City. They end up losing all their money, and the mother takes the two girls to live with the grandfather who had sexually abused her and her mother's sister. Liz doesn't want to live there, ran away, lived on the streets for a long time. She goes to school full time, and she's homeless, and she graduates high school and got her life together and got into Harvard, got accepted to Harvard University. It painted a lot of dynamics between her sister and her family that exaggerated what was really going on. Liz had a bit more support in her actual life than the movie would indicate she did, but Liz took a lot of care writing the story and being involved in the creation of the movie. You have a 2-hour movie, so you're condensing a storyline. So in this movie, a lot of the events were squished together, and a big chunk of her life was not even included in the movie. When you look up inaccuracies in Homeless to Harvard, now, these are real people. Liz is a real person, her sister's a real person, her parents were real people, and Harvard's a real university. So here are some of the inaccuracies here. So exaggerated timelines, dragging some things out and condensing others, softened depictions of family dysfunction. So making it not look as bad as it might have been, or hiding the uncomfortable parts, but not enough to make a point. So some of the depictions of her family were glossed over. And then oversimplified portrayals of her academic achievements and challenges. So academic achievements, maybe they glorified those. Maybe they made her challenges bigger than they actually were. There's a scene where she's washing dishes and she has all her notes for a test above the sink, and she's washing dishes and reading her notes. Who knows if she really did that? There's a scene of her sleeping in a hallway in an abandoned building, and she's got a flashlight and she's studying, like those sorts of things. So they give us some key inaccuracies. So time compression is one. The movie may condense the time it took Liz to achieve success, making it seem like her turnaround was faster than reality. She completed 4 years of high school in 2 years, but when you're watching the movie, it doesn't feel like it's 2 years. The movie makes it seem like it's 2 consecutive years. Maybe it was 2 years worth of schooling, but it took 3 years to complete. Does that make sense? The family dynamics does portray drug addiction and homelessness, but there were a lot of nuances in her relationships with her parents that might not have come through. And that would be my estimation of why it was done this way, would be because it was too much information. The academic details, it simplified the process of her achievements. Like, oh, she gets into a school. Oh, she just gets supported. Oh, and it sort of seems like it all falls into place. So it downplays the challenges that she faced in terms of catching up. And you see that she's working really hard, but yeah, it doesn't go into specific details. It does gloss it over a bit. They didn't lie about the fact that she was homeless and got to Harvard, but they embellished the story. She didn't graduate from Harvard. She transferred to Columbia, which is another amazing school, right? To take care of her father. And it took her until 2009 to graduate with her degree. So she went off to Harvard, and the movie leaves it there. She's sitting at a table telling all the people that are giving her this amazing scholarship to Harvard that she'd give it all back. If she could have her family back, it makes me cry because it reminds me of what I'd give back to have Molly. And the movie ends there. So you have this glossed over idea that she has a Harvard degree. No, she didn't. It took her a long time to get through college. I would have to say overall, it doesn't send a false message in ways that remember the Titan. It doesn't manipulate history and factual history the way that some movies did, like Pocahontas. Like, let's take a story and completely rewrite it. But what it did was it exaggerated some parts and minimized others to follow a narrative that could be captured in a 2-hour movie that would basically say, you too can be homeless and get into Harvard. So again, all of these examples remind me of, regular communications, things that we do, how we tell our stories, how we remember our history, and what we do with information to send a specific message. Why did I do this myth information about movies and historical relevance and historical inaccuracies and telling the story in a way that didn't happen? Why am I sharing all this? Well, a couple of reasons. With the invention of AI, with the ease of information getting, all I have to do is ask my phone questions, and I did it in the recording of this podcast. You're not going to see it because my editor will edit it out, but a couple of times I stopped and looked something up. I didn't have to walk to the library to find the answer to that question. I didn't have to say, oh, I can't include this because I didn't take notes on it, and I no longer have the book that I read about this topic. I can do 90% of my research on my iPhone right here. Information is now accessible by simply asking something that you're holding in your hand. I talked to my sister Eleanor about this yesterday during Thanksgiving, how you don't have to do anything now. You just have to ask a question and you get an answer. But then you have to look at where did the answer come from. So there are websites, Wikipedia, for example, but Wikipedia is malleable. It can be altered. So somebody could read Wikipedia and be like, that's not exactly right, and alter the Wikipedia, make a change. Sometimes the changes are correct. Let's make this factually relevant. Wikipedia isn't an allowed reference in a research paper in the educational setting because it's too malleable, I guess is the best word. There's a website like The Onion. That's a satire website. You can find if news stories are true by researching the validity of the news story. So a great example of a documentary, a movie based on actual events would be The News. The News is the summary of actual events. If you watch Fox News's coverage of the assassination attempt on Trump and MSNBC's coverage of the very same event, it is two very different stories, coming at it from a very different angle to make a very different summary of the event. I feel neither of them are accurate. So I've always just been a network news watcher. So in this podcast, I've talked about how much of these movies I believed, even though I knew they were based on real life and they weren't necessarily real life. I guess my point in this episode would be pay attention to news stories and look at them as presentations that are based on actual events. When we watch the news, it's based on an actual event. Yes, something happened, but the news writers are prohibited from using some words, have to use other words, have an angle they're coming from. So they're going to present the news in a way that supports their angle. It's like my comment about things like the Diabetes Association, all right? So their sponsors are yogurt companies and dairy companies and candy companies. So they have to support their sponsors in the advice they give to people with diabetes. And so a lot of the dietary suggestions are totally suspect when you look at really what works for people with diabetes. When you have a cancer website and one of their funders is a cigarette company. So is the cigarette company funding research because it feels bad that it gave people cancer? Or is it funding the Cancer Association so it can prevent a cure from ever happening? Because healing sickness without curing them, managing symptoms is big money. So my point, and let's just look at some movies that we enjoyed, feel-good movies that made us love what we just saw, movies that made us fall in love with the main character, movies that made us hate a secondary character. All of this is somebody's interpretation of an actual event. And in my never-ending now search for truth and myth information, I realized that all of life, our memories, our interactions are actually based on actual events and not actual events themselves. Thank you for listening. But if you have a movie that you loved that I didn't mention that you now realize isn't what you thought it was, I'd love to hear about it because we all like to watch movies, don't we? Happy New Year, wherever you are. I hope you're doing something fun. So be good to yourself. 2024 is over. Woo-hoo! We're into 2025 if you follow a Gregorian calendar. So be good to yourself. Be good to someone else. Tell someone Happy New Year. If you're out at a party and somebody's drunk, driving home, be good to someone else. And as always, have a good day, everybody.
Hey, thanks for listening and supporting the podcast. Feel free to leave a review and share my stories with your friends. Please reach out with your own stories, as I love connecting with my listeners. If you would like to get to know Molly, head over to mollybfoundation.org to see what she is all about. If you want to see what I'm up to next, you can find me on Instagram at barb_444, on Facebook as Barb Higgins, and at my website, 1000tinysteps.com. And while you're there, sign up for my newsletter, a weekly way to find out what's up in the life of Barb Higgins.